I honestly can't believe I'm saying this, but after 7 years of development and 40 hours, I finally reached the endgame of Granblue Fantasy Relink. I wanted to just share some of my final thoughts on the game so far and what I want to see from the game in the future. There won't be any explicit spoilers for the gameplay or the story, but I will be talking about the endgame gameplay loop towards the end. There won't be anything on screen, so you can just listen to it. To give context to my perspective on the game as a whole, I've played every single Monster Hunter game since Freedom Unite, and I've done most of the high-end raid content in Final Fantasy XIV as well, so I'm used to the franchises and gameplay loops that this game was built on. I also played this game with my FF14 friend, and the whole game felt like we were learning the Stormblood raids again for the first time, which is a high we've been chasing for literal years. Like, I feel like this game scratched that itch of doing FF14 raids without the time commitment of actually playing FF14, which is a huge compliment. Starting off with the story of Granblue Relink, it's very adjacent to the gacha game's early story with a few elements of the What Makes the Sky Blue series and the Society storylines. It assumes you have the bare minimum understanding of the first few chapters of the story and doesn't go beyond that much, which is great for new fans of the series. The game even gives you access to a ton of glossary entries on world-building terms and concepts similar to FF16's 1000 Tomes mechanic. You could easily spend hours reading through most of it if it interests you. I compare the story of not just Relink, but Granblue Fantasy as a franchise to Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn in particular, which makes sense as most of the early staff of this game worked on Final Fantasy titles in the past. Fun fact, Nobuo Uematsu composed some of the music for Granblue Fantasy. If you enjoy Final Fantasy XIV's story, you'll pretty much enjoy this story and world by default. Granblue in general is a game that's story is heavily oriented around individuals and groups of characters' storylines as opposed to an overarching narrative, which is where the writing really shines. Just like the gacha, each playable character has their own standalone storylines called Fate episodes that highlight their background and personality. The devs definitely want you to go and play the gacha game to experience their full story though, as every character gets at most 2 paragraphs of their gacha game's exposition, followed by a small story completely original to Granblue Relink. And as always on this channel, we gotta talk about the music. It's fire. Definitely check it out if you ever have the chance, like I highly recommend it. The composer of Granblue Relink, Sutsuma Narita, worked on the music for Final Fantasy XV, Xenoblade Chronicles, and The Last Story. Go check that out. You know how much I love those if you know this channel. The gameplay loop of Granblue Relink is a combination of Monster Hunter, Final Fantasy XIV, and Phantasy Star Online 2, which is right up my alley. Each of these characters in this game is either based on a class in FF14 or a weapon in Monster Hunter. To give some direct examples, Io's a Black Mage from 14, Zeta is Aerial Insect Glaive from Monster Hunter Generations, Vayne is a combination of Hammer and Hunting Horn, Eugen, or Eugen I guess, is Heavy Bowgun, especially with his damage and utility, Siegfried is a combination of Greatsword and Longsword with Sword and Shield's perfect rush mechanic, and Armaya is Virgil from DMC with all the stigma and negativity that comes with being a Longsword player that doesn't know how to play Longsword. You know who you are. I know you're in this game too, I've come across all of y'all. There's a ton of character archetypes and playstyles to choose from, and they're all unique while being familiar to fans of the other series. Quests take on average 5 to at most 10 minutes, which is a huge plus for people who don't have a ton of time to play the game. Progressing these characters pre-endgame is done through a robust skill tree that may be daunting at first, but is actually really easy to complete if you just focus on 1 or 2 characters at a time. As of now, at about 40 hours, I have 3 out of 20 characters completely maxed out, and I still haven't even played 2/3 of the roster because I'm having so much fun with my main characters. And this is my favorite part about FF14 and Monster Hunter in this game as well. If I ever get bored of one weapon, I can always refresh my gameplay by playing someone else completely different. There are also sigils in this game, which are essentially skills and materia in Monster Hunter and Final Fantasy XIV respectively. These are dropped by completing quests, with the highest tiers being dropped through RNG, which I'll talk about later. In terms of difficulty, I found that the base game didn't really have any major spikes in difficulty, which isn't a bad thing. Side games did this with their fighting game Granblue Versus 2, where they kept the skill floor really low so they don't alienate their gacha audience, which is completely understandable. Just like the gacha game's Rake 120 difficulty curve, Granblue Relink's postgame is where the game really starts to open up in my opinion. After the player beats the story, they unlock Maniac mode, where the devs begin gradually introducing more enemy variations and mechanics to the player. I felt that this transition from base to postgame was a little lacking though, because they pretty much pull a Dark Souls 2 level design and start reskinning enemies and forcing you to fight 2 of the exact same minor bosses at the exact same time. And they basically go,
"Thank y'all for taking on this ride with me. Yeah. You know what? Here go 2 more for y'all."
There isn't really a substantial difficulty curve or gear requirement in Maniac mode, so we stomped the majority of this difficulty without any trouble, which made some of the survival and horde quests feel a little bit tedious. What I really liked about Maniac mode was that the story still continues throughout it though. I was really engaged in the post-game storyline and the ending of it felt really fulfilling. I was honestly pretty worried about the lack of substantial difficulty spike in Maniac mode though, which thankfully went completely out the door once we reached Proud mode. Proud mode is essentially reaching G rank in Monster Hunter or the Savage Raids in Final Fantasy XIV. There's a ton of new mechanics, phases, and completely original bosses here that are introduced in Proud mode, and you have to completely change your build and gameplay around them. This difficulty spike caught me completely off guard and I loved every minute of it. The quests are now primarily bosses and more substantial now than just fight two of the same enemy. The game also introduces a bunch of RNG mechanics into progression, which I was fully expecting, but again, more on this later. The true endgame of Granblue Relink is what I really wanted to address in this video. I reached this point in the game recently, and as soon as I realized what I was up against, I decided to just stop playing and take a break for now. As a Granblue Fantasy player, you best believe I was fully expecting the endgame of this game to be completely grind, like a disgusting grind, and I was low-key even looking forward to it. But the main issue of Granblue Relink's endgame grind is that it comes to a strong halt as soon as you beat the final quest. The game doesn't even really tell you this, but your only real option after beating the final quest is to grind the final quest over and over and over again until you get a Terminus weapon, which is the best weapon in the game. There's really no reason to do anything else in the game besides that if you don't have a Terminus weapon, no matter how you look at it, and the drops for them are abysmally low and they aren't guaranteed to drop for the character you're playing. So you're basically just grinding this for every character in the game until you get the one that you want for your specific character. And then you're pretty much gated to that character after you finish grinding that. You just keep grinding, that's it. On top of that, the fight isn't even all that interesting or difficult after the first clear, it's just lengthy and tedious. I feel like it was a pretty big oversight to limit the grind to just the final quest, considering the last few Proud mode quests introduce completely new and interesting secret bosses that you have no reason to really fight after you complete them. The best way I describe Relink's state right now is to compare it to the base game of most Monster Hunter games. So think Monster Hunter World and Rise without Iceborne or Sunbreak. The main difference between Relink's endgame grind and Monster Hunter's endgame grind is that there's a ton of variety in Monster Hunter's bosses that you can fight, and zero in Relink. With Monster Hunter, you can always focus on another part or hunt to alleviate the tedium of building a full armor set, but Relink forces you into one quest and that quest only until you get good RNG. This approach to endgame doesn't really work in Relink because most of the character builds and sigils we have now are very homogenized, just like FF14 is now, unfortunately. Every character builds pretty much the same sigils in the endgame, and they're relatively easy to get outside of character specific ones, so there's very little incentive to focus on anything outside of grinding the same quest for Terminus weapon drops. Even with FF14's relic grind, you usually have 2 to 3 options on where and what you can do to upgrade them, unless they're just like tomestones or something like they've been doing recently. I feel like they could easily remedy this endgame grind by allowing more variety in the way that players can get Terminus weapons. Monster Hunter to this day solves the issue of homogenized builds by introducing new meta-defining skills with new monster updates and expansions. In Relink's case, this can be done when Lucilius or any other bosses drop in the future. And if they're worried about the player base catching up too fast, they could retroactively change the drop rates whenever the next boss drops, as I'm sure that fight will require you to have fully upgraded Terminus weapons or whatever the next weapon is anyway. I hope the developers consider these options as they move forward with their roadmap and continue developing the game in the future. My biggest hope is that this game is supported post-launch as extensively as the Monster Hunter games are, as we get new playable characters and bosses. Overall, Granblue Fantasy Relink was a phenomenal game that had a few easily fixable missteps in the mid and end game. Luckily, there's still a ton for me to explore within the game's roster, even if the endgame grind wasn't hitting for me personally, and I can't wait to see what else Cygames does with Granblue in the future. If you like video essays on JRPGs, storytelling, music, and fighting games, feel free to check out the rest of my channel or my Twitch. Thanks for coming through and watching.